It should have been a quiet afternoon. A soldier home from war, finally exhaling after months of chaos. But for Sergeant Marcus Johnson, peace lasted only seconds. Still in his fatigues, carrying groceries for his mother, he found himself staring down the barrel of prejudice. Officer Daniel Reeves saw only suspicion, not sacrifice. To him, Marcus was just another faker in uniform. In front of a stunned crowd, he slammed Marcus against a cruiser, never realizing this was the same man who once saved his own son's life overseas. What happens next will shake an entire town. Stay until the end, because the twist no one saw coming. Sergeant Marcus Johnson was a man who carried silence like armor. At 32, he had lived through more than most men twice his age. 2 tours overseas, firefights that painted the desert sky in flames, and nights where he wondered if he'd ever see home again. He had medals, yes, but they stayed tucked in drawers. What mattered to Marcus wasn't glory, it was survival. For his brothers in uniform, and for himself. Now, for the first time in years, he was back on Riverton's familiar streets. The cracked sidewalks, the old grocery store on Miller's Corner, the smell of fried chicken drifting from the diner, it all felt both foreign and painfully familiar. In one hand, he carried simple brown paper bags. Apples, fresh bread, and his mother's favorite peach preserves. In war, he had carried rifles, body armor, and wounded men through smoke and fire. At home, he wanted to carry nothing heavier than groceries. Marcus was the kind of man people instinctively respected. Broad shoulders, steady gaze, the discipline of a soldier etched into every movement. Yet, he never demanded respect. He lived by a quiet code: respect wasn't given, it was earned. Those who knew him remembered a boy who mowed lawns without complaint, a young man who stood up to bullies, and now, a soldier who had given years of his life to a country that often looked past men like him. But beneath the calm exterior, there was weariness. His body bore scars, shrapnel still lodged in his calf, ribs that ached in the rain, the invisible wounds of nights interrupted by nightmares. And yet, Marcus carried himself with quiet dignity. He smiled at the old grocer who remembered him as Little Marcus. He waved at the neighbor who once watched him throw footballs in the yard. He wanted to believe Riverton could see him now as more than just another black man in uniform. For Marcus, this was supposed to be a fresh start. Dinner with his mother. Laughter at a kitchen table untouched by gunpowder or sand. A life where the biggest decision was which jam to spread on warm bread. He had earned that peace, paid for it in sweat, blood, and years stolen overseas. But peace, he was about to learn, was fragile. Because not everyone in Riverton saw a hero when they looked at Marcus Johnson. Some only saw a threat. And on that quiet afternoon, all it would take was the wrong pair of eyes, clouded by prejudice, to turn his homecoming into another battlefield. Officer Daniel Reeves wasn't born a bad man, but he was raised in a system that rewarded his worst instincts. At 41, he wore his badge like a crown, not a duty. Tall, sharp-featured, with a jaw clenched so often it looked carved from stone, Reeves believed 2 things above all else: authority must never be questioned, and respect must be demanded, not earned. In Riverton, Reeves had a reputation. Some called him by the book, others called him a bully. It depended on who you asked. To his superiors, he was a cop who got results, a man who made arrests look neat and reports airtight. To the community, especially the black community, he was something else entirely. Traffic stops that turned into harassment, random checks that always seemed to target the same people, and a tone of voice that dripped with suspicion whenever he said the words, "Step out of the car." Reeves wasn't an outright villain in his own eyes. He told himself he was protecting the town. That the others needed to be kept in check. Deep down, though, he thrived on control. The weight of the badge, the feel of a gun at his side, the way people stiffened when he entered a room, it made him feel untouchable. Respect, in Reeves' mind, was owed to him the second his uniform was buttoned. At home, things were different. Reeves was divorced, his marriage collapsing under the weight of his temper and his long hours. He had one son, Tyler, whom he saw only on weekends. Tyler was the only soft spot in Reeves' world. The boy was everything he wanted to protect, but also everything he feared losing. Reeves told himself he was shaping Tyler into a man who respected order, who feared chaos, who obeyed rules. But in reality, he was teaching his son fear of stepping out of line, fear of disapproval, fear of weakness. Still, Tyler admired his father in a way only a boy could. To him, Reeves was a hero, a protector, a man who could stand between him and the world. What Reeves never realized was that his son's admiration didn't come from his authority, it came from a childhood memory of another man who had once saved him. A man Tyler would never forget. On duty, though, Reeves carried himself like a storm waiting to break. The smallest sign of disrespect could flip a switch. He'd tighten his grip, raise his voice, assert control. His partners whispered that he went too far sometimes, but they never spoke loudly enough for the brass to hear. And Reeves? He never saw the harm. To him, it was simple. The badge gave him power, and power was meant to be used. So when Reeves saw Marcus Johnson that afternoon, black, strong, in uniform, but not the kind of uniform Reeves respected, his instincts flared. He didn't see a veteran. He didn't see a protector. He saw a challenge to his authority. And in Reeves' world, challenges were meant to be crushed. It began with something so ordinary it should have been forgettable. Marcus, fresh from the grocery store, walked toward his mother's small brick house, the warm autumn sun painting the street in gold. He wore his fatigue still, part habit, part pride, part reminder to himself that he had survived what so many of his brothers had not. His stride was steady, his arms filled with bags, his mind already on the dinner his mother was waiting to cook. That's when the cruiser rolled up. The hum of its engine broke the quiet, followed by the sharp crunch of tires against gravel. Officer Reeves stepped out, one hand already brushing the holster at his hip, the other adjusting his sunglasses. His eyes narrowed the moment they landed on Marcus. "Hey!" Reeves barked. "You! Put the bags down." Marcus froze, confused at first, then cautious. He'd been trained to read body language, to sense hostility before the first shot was ever fired. Reeves' stance was aggressive, legs wide, chest puffed, chin tilted in the way of a man who thought he was already in control. "I'm just heading home, officer," Marcus replied evenly, his voice calm but firm. "Don't get smart with me," Reeves snapped, stepping closer. "Where'd you get that uniform?" Marcus blinked. "This uniform? It's mine. I earned it." But Reeves wasn't listening. To him, Marcus' words were a challenge, his calmness an act of defiance. The crowd began to stir, neighbors peeking from porches, a teenager pulling out a phone. Marcus could feel the shift. He was no longer just a man walking home, he was a target caught in someone else's crosshairs. Reeves circled like a wolf testing prey. "You trying to impersonate a soldier? That's a felony, you know. You boys think you can just throw on camouflage and get sympathy. Doesn't work on me." Marcus clenched his jaw but kept his composure. He'd stared down enemies who fired bullets. He wasn't about to break under a man firing insults. Still, the humiliation burned. Here he was, a man who had dragged bleeding comrades through sandstorms, who had stood guard under endless nights of mortar fire, being accused of pretending. "Officer," Marcus said, steady as stone, "I just came back from deployment. You can check my ID. I'm not looking for trouble." But trouble was already here. Reeves shoved him, hard enough that the bag spilled. Apples rolled into the gutter, bread tore open against the pavement. Gasps rose from the onlookers. Marcus' hands twitched, training urged him to defend, instinct urged him to strike, but discipline forced him still. Reeves smirked, mistaking restraint for weakness. "On your knees. Hands behind your head." Marcus' eyes locked onto his. A silent storm raged behind them. He wasn't a threat. He wasn't a criminal. But Reeves wanted a scene, and Marcus knew he was seconds away from becoming the evening headline. What Reeves didn't know, what no one on that street yet realized, was that this criminal in his grip was the very man who had once saved his son's life. And that truth, once revealed, would flip the entire town upside down. The street had gone silent, except for the sharp clicks of Reeves' boots against the pavement. Every step was an accusation. Every word was a weapon. The neighbors weren't just watching anymore, they were holding their breath. Phones were raised, lenses capturing each moment, but no one dared to intervene. Marcus stood tall, the grocery bag spilled at his feet, his dignity crumbling one apple at a time. He could feel his pulse in his throat, the taste of iron rising as anger mixed with restraint. He had learned long ago that silence could save lives. But this silence was different. It was heavy, suffocating, humiliating. Down on your knees. Reeves barked again, his hand resting firmly on the butt of his weapon. Now. Marcus swallowed hard. He knew exactly what this was. Not law enforcement, not an arrest, not justice. This was power being flexed, prejudice wearing a badge. He had seen this look before, in war zones where soldiers mistook civilians for enemies. The look of a man who saw what he wanted to see, regardless of truth. I'm not resisting, Marcus said evenly, raising his hand slightly. I'm a United States soldier. Check my ID, check my tags. Reeves scoffed. Oh, I'll check all right, after you're booked. Funny thing is, fakes like you always have a story ready. Always playing the hero. He sneered, leaning closer. But not today. Today, I'm the one in charge. Marcus' jaw tightened. His training screamed at him to de-escalate, but the sting of being called a liar in the very uniform that had cost him blood was unbearable. He thought of his brothers overseas, of nights patching up wounds by flashlight, of the day he pulled a terrified boy out of crossfire. That boy's face, frozen in fear, then relief, still haunted him. Now, staring at Reeves, Marcus felt something shift inside him. That boy had lived. That boy had a father. And that father was standing here now, holding him at gunpoint. Sir, Marcus said, voice deep with restrained fury, you don't know who I am. But you will. The crowd murmured at the weight of his words. Reeves' nostrils flared. He shoved Marcus again, harder this time, sending him stumbling against the hood of the cruiser. Metal groaned under the impact. Marcus caught himself, muscles coiled, discipline trembling on the edge of breaking. One more push, and war would erupt, not in the desert, but on this small town street. Stop resisting. Reeves shouted, even though Marcus hadn't moved. He wanted control, he wanted submission, he wanted the crowd to see him win. His hand hovered dangerously close to drawing his weapon. And that's when the sound cut through the air like thunder. Dad. The word froze everything. Reeves' hand stopped mid-motion. The crowd turned. And there, standing at the edge of the street, was Tyler, Reeves' son. Pale, wide-eyed, clutching a backpack as if it were a shield. Marcus' chest tightened. The years dissolved in a flash. The battlefield, the smoke, the boy's terrified scream. He remembered it all. Tyler had been there innocent, trapped in the chaos of a foreign land. Marcus had been the one who shielded him, who carried him, who gave him back his life. Now that same boy was here, staring at the scene, tears forming in his eyes. Dad, stop. Tyler shouted, his voice cracking. That's him. That's the man who saved me. The world seemed to tilt. Reeves blinked, his grip faltering, his authority suddenly trembling in the shadow of truth. The crowd erupted into whispers, cameras zooming in, capturing every flicker of disbelief on his face. And Marcus, still pressed against the cruiser, hands raised, watched as the pieces fell into place. He hadn't come home for recognition. He hadn't asked for gratitude. But fate had drawn this line in the sand. The soldier. The father. The truth. And in that moment, the entire street knew the real battle was about to begin. For a long second, no one moved. The only sound was Tyler's voice, still echoing through the street like a crack of lightning. That's him. He saved me. Reeves' hand slipped off his holster as his head jerked toward his son. What did you just say? His voice was sharp, uncertain, stripped of its earlier confidence. The crowd leaned in, phone steady, every lens capturing the moment a hardened officer began to unravel. Tyler ran forward, his small frame colliding with Marcus' side before Marcus could even react. The boy clutched Marcus like an anchor, his face buried in the fabric of his fatigues. "It's you. I remember your voice. You carried me. You told me I'd be okay." The weight of the boy's arms sent Marcus reeling back into memory, the chaos of that day overseas. Explosions in the distance, civilians screaming, a child crying beneath collapsed rubble. Marcus had ripped through smoke and fire, found a boy cowering, shielded him with his own body, and carried him through enemy fire until they reached safety. That boy had lived. And now, here he was. The crowd gasped as realization swept through them like a wave. Murmurs turned into declarations. He saved his son? That cop's arresting a hero. Unbelievable. Reeves' face twisted. Anger, disbelief, confusion, all warring inside a man used to control. His authority was slipping with every passing second, every whispered word. He looked at Tyler, then at Marcus, and for the first time, his voice cracked. "Tyler, you don't understand. This man," Reeves faltered, the accusation dying in his throat. Tyler pulled back, tears streaking his cheeks, his voice trembling but loud enough for everyone to hear. "No, Dad. He saved me when you weren't there. He risked his life for me." The street erupted. Applause mixed with outrage. Someone shouted, "Take the cuffs off him." Another voice cried, "That's the real hero." The thin veil of Reeves' authority was tearing apart, thread by thread. Marcus, still steady despite the storm, finally spoke. His voice was deep, calm, but laced with steel. "You accused me of lying, of pretending to wear this uniform. But your son knows the truth. He's alive because of me. And that uniform," he straightened his posture, his fatigues catching the light, "was earned." Reeves staggered back as if the words themselves had struck him. His hand trembled at his side, fingers twitching uselessly. His chest heaved with something he couldn't name, shame, perhaps, or the terrifying recognition that the man he tried to humiliate was the very man who had given him the gift no one else could, his son's life. The cameras zoomed in. Neighbors whispered louder. And in that public square of judgment, Reeves' badge felt suddenly like a chain around his neck. "Dad," Tyler's voice cut again, softer this time. "Say you're sorry." The word stabbed deeper than any reprimand could. Reeves' mouth opened, closed, then opened again. The man who had commanded fear from criminals, silence from subordinates, and obedience from his family suddenly found himself powerless before a child's plea. The silence stretched. Marcus' eyes never left Reeves. He didn't gloat, didn't smirk, just stood tall, waiting. And finally, Reeves broke. His shoulders slumped, his jaw unclenched, and his gaze dropped to the ground. When he spoke, his voice was hoarse. "I was wrong." The crowd erupted, some in relief, some in fury, but all in disbelief at witnessing a cop confess on the street. Reeves lifted his eyes to Marcus, shame flooding them. "I didn't see you. I didn't want to see you." Marcus didn't move, didn't soften. His voice was steady as a gavel. "No. You chose not to." That truth cut deeper than any insult Reeves had ever hurled. He nodded, defeated. For once, he had no authority to cling to, no power to wield. The moment ended with Tyler still clinging to Marcus, the crowd recording, and Reeves standing exposed, not just as a cop, but as a man stripped of every illusion of superiority. The battlefield had shifted. And Marcus Johnson had won, not with fists, not with rage, but with truth. The crowd did not disperse quickly. What had started as an ordinary afternoon had turned into a reckoning, and no one wanted to look away. Dozens of phones were still pointed at Reeves, recording every flicker of his downfall. For the first time in his career, the officer who thrived on intimidation stood in silence, not because he chose to, but because the truth had caged him. Marcus gently loosened Tyler's grip and knelt to meet him at eye level. "You're safe, kid," he said softly, his hand resting on the boy's shoulder. "Just like I promised you years ago." Tyler nodded, wiping his tears, clinging to Marcus' words as if they were armor. The boy turned toward his father. Reeves looked at him, searching for the authority that once commanded obedience. But in Tyler's eyes, Reeves no longer saw fear or blind admiration, he saw disappointment. And that cut deeper than any reprimand from a superior ever could. Neighbors began to murmur words Marcus had never expected to hear. Hero. Protector. He saved a life. Strangers who once might have crossed the street to avoid him now stepped closer, their gazes softened with respect. In that moment, Marcus wasn't just a black man in fatigues, he was finally seen for who he truly was, a soldier, a survivor, a man of honor. An elderly woman from across the street stepped forward, placing a hand over her heart. "Thank you for your service," she whispered, her voice trembling with sincerity. Others echoed her, one by one, until the whole street hummed with gratitude. Marcus nodded, humbled but reserved. He hadn't come back seeking applause. All he wanted was peace. But if his story had to be dragged into the open, at least it had forced people to look beyond their prejudice. Reeves, meanwhile, stood on the periphery of his own collapse. His badge felt heavier than ever. The weight of his choices, his arrogance, his blindness, it all pressed down on him. For years, he had wielded power as a weapon. And now, stripped bare in front of his community and his son, he finally understood what true strength looked like. It wasn't in force. It wasn't in control. It was in sacrifice, the kind Marcus had shown on foreign soil, and again today, by not letting rage consume him. "Marcus," Reeves began, his voice cracking. The apology hung unfinished in the air, fragile and raw. But Marcus didn't wait for him to finish. "You don't owe me words," Marcus said, his tone firm yet steady. "You owe your son better. Start there." The words landed harder than a punch. Reeves dropped his gaze, shame swallowing him whole. Tyler, still clinging to Marcus' sleeve, looked between the two men, the soldier who had saved him and the father who had nearly lost him again. The sirens in the distance signaled that other units were arriving, drawn by reports of an officer's confrontation gone wrong. But by the time they pulled in, the story was already out. Videos were streaming online. The town had witnessed the truth. Marcus bent to pick up his spilled groceries. His mother's peach preserves, miraculously unbroken, gleamed in the sunlight. He lifted the jar, tucked it into the bag, and turned toward home. For Marcus Johnson, the war had always been about survival. But today, in the middle of Riverton, he had won a different kind of battle, one that could not be measured in medals or scars. He had defended his dignity, his truth, and, unknowingly, given a community the chance to see what real heroism looked like. And as he walked away, Tyler's voice followed, small but clear, "Thank you, sir." Marcus smiled, just faintly, and kept walking. And that's how a single moment on a hot afternoon shattered years of silence. Sergeant Marcus Johnson came home a hero, but instead of parades, he found prejudice waiting at his doorstep. What Officer Reeves didn't know was that the man he accused of being a fraud was the very soldier who had carried his own son through fire. Think about that. A father so blinded by bias that he couldn't see the man who gave him back his child. It wasn't just a bad stop, it was a mirror. A mirror showing us how dangerous prejudice can be, and how quickly authority can crumble when faced with truth. Marcus didn't win today by fighting back. He won by standing tall, by refusing to be broken, and by letting the truth speak louder than any badge or weapon. Reeves may have lost his authority, but in that loss, he gained something he never had before, a chance to face his own reflection. And for the people of Riverton, that day wasn't just about an officer and a soldier, it was about accountability, about finally seeing the difference between power and respect. So, what do you think? Should Reeves get a second chance after what he did, or did Marcus' restraint expose a truth too big to forgive? Drop your thoughts in the comments. And if stories like this matter to you, stories about justice, truth, and dignity, make sure to like, share, and subscribe. Because these aren't just stories. their lessons, and sometimes their warnings.